Join the coven.
This is my confession, a story written by Juniper_June_HJH. Hello, my name is Cynthia Collins, and this is my confession. I am writing this today to lift the burden of a lie off my chest, which will hopefully clear my nagging conscience, so that I may live out the rest of my life without the depressing strain of a secret. For 3 decades, my lips have been sealed, swearing to never tell a single soul for the fear of damning myself to spending all my days behind bars. However, as I'm nearing 50 years old, I've realized that the dark feeling of guilt clinging to the back of my mind won't subside until I admit the heinous acts that I committed. So here it is, my confession. The year was 1985. Unlike most 16-year-olds who were enjoying the luxury of sleeping in on a Saturday morning, I was wide awake at 7 a.m. preparing for my breakfast shift at Putsy's Diner. I stood in front of the cracked floor-length mirror that leaned against my bedroom door, glaring at my plain Jane reflection. I silently wondered to myself if I would ever be able to shed this boring, barefaced look. But sporting a fading blue apron and an army-style bun certainly wasn't helping my case. "Come on, Cynthia. Mr. Franklin says we ain't gonna have a job if we're late again," my younger sister Luann called out impatiently from the hallway. At the young age of 14, she too was spending all of her free time slaving away at a demanding minimum wage job in order to contribute to the household bills. While it may sound quite cruel to force a young teen to help keep the lights on, you must understand that this was the only way our family could afford to survive. Besides, we were used to this way of life at that point. You see, my siblings and I grew up dirt poor smack dab in the middle of a backwoods hick town. So we weren't allowed the comfort of a blissful, carefree childhood. However, unlike most people with a less than fulfilling youth, I don't blame my mama. She was a single mother with 7 mouths to feed. And even in our rinky-dink trailer, we were barely making ends meet. I walked into the kitchen hearing Mama's raspy chatter as she puffed on a Pall Mall, still dressed in her Kroger uniform from the night before. "About time you get yourself together. It don't take that long to get decent enough to hand someone some waffles," my older sister Jennifer huffed irritably. Although there was only a year between us, Jennifer had the features of a grown woman, while I could still be mistaken for a child, something I was very jealous of for a while. I quietly scurried over towards the front door, slipping on my hand-me-down flats. Mama rested the phone on her shoulder. "The van is low on gas, so unless you got $5 to put in it, y'all best get to walking. And Cynthia, if I get another call from Mr. Franklin, your butt is grass, you hear?" We all nodded, our heads in unison, knowing she meant business. With that, my sisters and I stepped out of the door to begin our hike to one of the worst jobs I have ever had. Don't get me wrong, I was grateful to be employed at the time, but to this day, I haven't met a boss as angry as Mr. Franklin. Jennifer nudged my arm. We came to the crosswalk at the end of our street. "So, you should come out to the wishing well with me tonight. You know, Johnny's cousin knows a guy who says it's possessed by a witch. And if you throw in a quarter, she'll grant you any wish you want. Not wanting to make eye contact with my obnoxiously superstitious sister, I shrugged my shoulders. Oh, come on. I demand that you have some fun. I'll even bring a quarter for you. Please? Jennifer attempted to bargain my attendance. I sighed, knowing that her begging and bribes would just grow increasingly worse. Fine, but you better bring that quarter. A smile crept across her ruby-painted lips, as if she had just won an unspoken game between us, before skipping ahead of me, full of glee. Oftentimes, I envied her ability to ignore the negative aspects of our life, like the eviction notice looming over all of our heads. She always has been able to see the brighter side. I have to admit, though, I was kind of excited about spending an evening away from the house, even if it was just to toss a coin into a crummy waterhole. I peeked over the moss-covered cobblestone that surrounded stagnant water with curious eyes. Unsurprisingly, I saw nothing but floating beer tabs and a slight glimmer of long-forgotten change. Jennifer giggled, her boyfriend behind me, who had his arms wrapped around her waist, seemingly disregarding the reason why we were there. "What are you going to wish for, Cynthia?" whispered Luann as she fidgeted with a coin between her fingers. Well, honestly, I hadn't thought about that. Posing for a moment, I pondered about what I wanted most in my life. Hitting the lottery, having no bills, and unlimited food all seemed like plausible wishes. But there was one thing I wanted more than all of those material items combined. I wanted to know who my father was. Yeah, I know. Very cliché. Just another poor kid with an absent dad. Actually, the story is pretty stereotypical. As it goes, he left shortly after Luann was born. Mama always said Daddy ran off with a no-good mistress, though Jennifer claimed he chose to be with his wife on the other side of town. It didn't matter which version of the tale was factual. Mama refused to reveal who my daddy was. I still felt that if I knew his identity, I'd understand why he decided to leave us behind. Maybe we were too unruly, or maybe Mama was too mean. Whatever the reason was, it had to have been a good one. Daddy didn't abandon his own flesh and blood just because, right? Closing my eyes, I let the coin slip between my knuckles as I mumbled to myself. I wish I knew my dad's name. Splash. As I expected, the most exciting thing to happen in that moment was the thudding sound of a wasted quarter hitting the bottom of the well. Later on that night, I laid in my shared bed with nothing but the stars comforting my irrational fear of the dark. Trying to drift off to sleep, I scolded myself for believing such a foolish myth about an abandoned, glorified money fountain. How could I have been so dumb? Suddenly, a slight tapping on my window jolted me out of my internal conflict. I sprung straight up, snapping my attention to the glass pane hanging beside my bed. What I saw still horrifies me to this day. A black bird-like creature had perched itself upon my windowsill. Its red marble-like eyes pierced through the engulfing darkness outside, while its sharp, curling claws dug into the wood supporting its decaying body. Flaking skin peeled away, showing green ooze seeping from its sores around the creature's rib cage. What the hell? Was all I could mutter with fear. It opened its mouth to speak, revealing jagged teeth aligned in neat little rows. "Aren't you going to let me in, dear? It's dreadfully cold out." His voice mimicked deep, cackling thunder, pulling the blanket above my face, leaving only my eyes exposed. I shook my head, fully convinced this thing would eat me. "I don't bite," he sneered with a grin I can only compare to the Cheshire cat. Again, I shook my head no, this time managing to sputter out. "How do I know you ain't gonna kill me?" A sinister laugh floated through the stale air, echoing off our cigarette smoke-stained walls. The creature clasped its bony hands together while the skin around its knuckles slothed onto the surface below him. "I have a proposition for you. It has come to my attention that you, my sweet child, are seeking knowledge on a man. Your father, I'm presuming?" My heart pounded in my ears. Nothing but a whisper escaped my throat. "How did you know?" One of his dirty yellow claws scratched the middle of its forehead, peeling a wad of it clean off. Yet he remained unfazed. "Young child, that was your wish, correct?" I dropped the blanket that concealed my sheer terror, beginning to gain trust in this demon-like creature. "Yes, that's what I asked for," I calmly explained, raising what was left of his eyebrow. A crooked smirk formed upon his chapped lips. "What are you waiting on, dear? Let me in so that I may present you with the answers you desire." I thought about running far away, but this weird thing had information I'd been seeking my whole life. Instead, against my better judgment, I slowly lifted the window, giving this monster permission to enter my home. He slithered inside, the smell of rotten eggs wafting close behind him. I watched intently as he spun in circles, bones snapping with each twirl before finally curling up on my bedpost. "What's your name?" I asked, breaking the silence that had blanketed over us. The creature yawned with boredom. "I was given the name Confession, and you are Cynthia. Next question, please, and this time, make it less mind-numbing." Taken aback that Confession had known who I was, I scrambled to ask, What are you?" He growled while tapping his nails against his pointy fangs. "Think of me as your pet. I've been assigned to you. I'm your Confession. There are numerous others like me, but I'm tailored just for you." I took a deep breath, relaxing a bit, realizing Confession wasn't here to rip me apart. Before I could speak up and express my gratitude for not turning me into his next meal, he loudly interjected. "Let's come to a conclusion on a deal. A trade of sorts. I'll bring you to your father, and you, sweet child, give me a tortured soul." I threw my hands up, stopping this conversation in its tracks. Whoa! A tortured soul? You mean like a human soul? Confession nodded in agreement, seemingly pleased with my comprehension. "That's right. Aren't you a smart young girl? Furthermore, the soul must be, how can I put this in simpler terms? Miserable, full of hatred and distaste. Perhaps Mrs. Dawson, will be a perfect match. Deal? I'd always dreamed of never having to lay eyes on my math teacher, Mrs. Delson, again. She was a mean old woman who intentionally picked on me for reasons I had yet to figure out. I'll never forget the day she told me, "Cynthia Collins, I can't bear the sight of your failure face. You'll never amount to anything, just like your mother." Without hesitation, I shouted, "Deal!" Confession wriggled his decaying carcass across my sheets, wrapping what felt like a squishy paper thin flesh around my torso. Not uttering a word, in an instant I was transported into an odd room, decorated with fancy, expensive items that I could never afford. Jumping back with surprise, I noticed that a sleeping Mrs. Delson was resting in the bed in front of me, with a familiar frown plastered upon her face. Confession pressed a skeletal finger to his lips. "They cannot hear us," I observed from behind as he sunk his bright white fangs into Mrs. Delson's arms, jerking his head back, strings of bloody muscles and bits of yellow fat slung onto the ceiling. Her eyes shot open as an agonizing scream barreled from her gaping mouth. He dug his claws deep into her chest, while she arched her back, gasping for air. But instead of oxygen, she was met with gurgled blood from punctured lungs. Finally, he finished her off by pulling out a beating heart and ate it as if it were a hamburger instead of a vital organ. Confession purred like a cat on top of the pile of mangled meat that was once Mrs. Delson, while licking his fingers in triumph. "See that man with red hair and freckles, just like you, my sweet child? The one sleeping next to his dearly beloved wife's body? That man is your creator." I pushed back my long hair, still hyperventilating from watching a brutal murder. "What?" "Yes, beautiful child. That man left your mother to reside with his pitiful excuse for a wife, 3 little girls that loved him so. Yet he chose to let them live in poverty, while he swims in wealth. Such a crime. Too bad I can't give him the same treatment as a significant other. He's too happy with his decisions, not a tortured bone in his body. However, maybe you can aid him to feel the pain you've felt all these years." Confession jerked at his canine tooth, pulling out what appeared to be a handmade knife. Tears fell from my eyes as anger rose in my face. How could my father rest on silk sheets while I was forced to slumber on stained linens? How could he eat steak and lobster while we choked down ramen noodles every night? How could he take leisure knowing that his children work their butts off every single day just to have dinner? I snatched the knife from Confession and plunged it deep into my father's chest. Maybe for a split second he felt what it was like to have a broken heart before he succumbed to death. That was my confession. What's yours?